Imagine a winter mountain where the snow never truly melts and the silence is so deep it feels like the world has forgotten how to breathe. On that frozen ridge lives a man who once saved lives for a living and now hides from his own shadow. One night, a storm rises like a living beast, and from beneath the ice, a single trembling hand reaches up into the darkness. What follows is not just a rescue, but a battle between guilt and redemption, between fear and courage, between a man who chose to disappear and a destiny that refuses to let him go. Before we begin this journey of loss, hope, and second chances, tell me where you are watching from, and leave your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be shared, please press subscribe now to support the channel and walk this winter miracle with us. The snow had been falling over Frostfall Ridge since morning, slow and steady at first, then heavier by afternoon, as if the mountain itself were being quietly buried beneath layers of white silence, and the narrow road that once connected the ridge to the nearest town faded into a pale scar swallowed by drifting wind. Frostfall Ridge was not a place people came to be found. It was where the wounded came to hide, where the broken buried themselves under cold and distance, and hoped the world might forget their names. At the northern edge of that forgotten ridge stood a weather-beaten cabin half sunken into the slope, smoke barely escaping its crooked chimney. And inside that cabin lived a man who had chosen to disappear from every life he once touched. Elias Ward was 37, tall with the worn build of a man forged in discipline rather than comfort, his shoulders still broad despite years of isolation, his dark hair threaded with premature silver that no mirror had ever truly claimed, his face weathered by cold wind and long nights without sleep. His eyes, once sharp and decisive on battlefields that never slept, now carried a distant, guarded stillness, the kind that only came from a man who had learned that seeing too clearly could destroy a soul. He spoke little, not because he lacked words, but because he no longer trusted them, and when he did speak, his voice stayed low, roughened by disuse and memory. To the few townsfolk who occasionally saw him in winter supply runs, he was a rumor more than a man, known only as the ghost medic on the ridge, the veteran who had returned from war and vanished into snow. What they did not know was that Elias had not vanished to escape the world. He had vanished because the world would not release him. Years ago, under a screaming Afghan sky, where wind and sand and ice collided like living weapons, Elias had been a combat medic trained to move forward no matter what fear demanded, trained to treat life as something that could always be salvaged if the hands were fast enough and the mind was steady. On one violent night swallowed by snow and chaos, two soldiers lay wounded ahead of him, one closer, one farther, both bleeding, both calling through storm and static. And in that terrible instant between duty and instinct, Elias hesitated, choosing the closer body while the farther one slipped beyond reach. The closer soldier lived. The other never came back from the storm. The war ended for Elias on that frozen ground, even though his body survived to walk out of it. After discharge, medals gathered dust in drawers he never opened, while guilt grew heavy enough to bend his spine. And eventually he fled, trading cities for silence, people for snow, until only the ridge remained. The only living soul that shared that isolation was Coda, a retired German shepherd once trained for military service. Now 5 years old, massive in frame, with a thick sable coat dusted with silver along the muzzle, a faint scar visible beneath his left ear where shrapnel had once kissed fur and bone alike, his amber eyes alert even in rest, carrying the quiet intelligence of a creature who had learned the language of danger too early in life. Coda was not merely a companion. He had once been transferred to Elias after saving his life during a violent panic episode that nearly ended with a jump from a hospital roof, the dog's weight pinning him back to the living world when reason had already let go. Since then, Coda had become both guardian and anchor, watching over a man who no longer trusted himself to remain standing alone. That evening, as the storm thickened into a howling wall, Elias moved quietly around the cabin, reinforcing shutters, stacking extra wood near the hearth, his hands steady by habit even when the world outside grew violent. Coda lay near the fire, head resting on broad paws, breathing slow but eyes open, tracking the wind through instinct older than training. It was near dusk when the sound came, not a cry, not a voice, but the sharp, unnatural strike of metal against ice, distant and brief, almost lost beneath the roar of the blizzard. Koda's ears rose immediately, his head lifting in a single smooth motion, the muscles along his neck tightening as he listened into the storm. Elias did not react at first. Storms sang many strange songs, and he had learned to distrust every echo that tried to lure him back into motion. But then the sound came again. A scraping pull this time, metal dragged sideways across frozen surface with desperate uneven rhythm, and something in Elias's chest tightened in a way he could not ignore. Koda rose without barking, moving to the door and standing rigid as if carved from shadow and firelight. Every line of his body pointed outward. Elias pulled on his coat, hesitation warring with instinct, as old memories stirred like ghosts beneath the floorboards of his mind. And he whispered the word that once would have meant command, "Stay." But Koda did not stay, not out of disobedience, but because some urgencies outranked human rules. The storm struck the moment they stepped outside, wind clawing at their bodies with icy teeth, snow filling the air so thick that the world shrank into 10 trembling feet of visibility, the rest swallowed by white void. Koda moved ahead low and focused, nose cutting through snow and scent alike, while Elias followed, boots sinking deep into drifts that shifted underfoot like living water. Then the ground changed. A thin, dark line cut across the whiteness, shallow but unmistakable, where snow had been scraped and crushed, as if something had been pulled unwillingly across the frozen earth. Elias stopped breathing. He knelt slowly, glove brushing the trench, and found beneath it the faint smear of blood already glazing to ice. The line led downhill toward the ravine, where the river passed beneath Winter's skin, a dangerous stretch even in daylight. The footprints staggered and returned, uneven and desperate, more fall than walk, until finally the trail ended at shattered ice. The river's surface had broken inward, jagged and black, water moving beneath like a living mouth. Koda whined softly, a sound filled not with fear but urgency, and Elias crawled forward on hands and knees, peering into the fracture as wind tore breath from his lungs. At first, there was nothing, only drifting snow and rippling darkness, and for one terrible second, Elias felt the old crushing weight of helplessness flood back through him, the echo of that Afghan storm rising in his ears. Then the ice shifted. A faint crack widened. From the black water beneath, a human hand emerged, pale blue beneath skin already numbed by cold, fingers trembling as they clawed uselessly against the slick edge. The sleeve that followed was unmistakable, dark blue fabric marked with the patch of a mountain precinct. Police insignia barely visible beneath frost and water. A woman was trapped beneath the ice. Elias did not think. He moved. Koda lunged forward with him, snow and wind and fear dissolving into pure motion as the man who had spent years learning how to disappear threw himself back into the world with both hands, shattering ice with his axe, dragging broken plates aside despite freezing water biting into his arms, shouting wordless sound into the storm as Koda anchored his weight and helped pull the limp body upward inch by inch. The woman's face surfaced briefly in that struggle, young but drawn tight with cold, dark hair frozen into her lashes, her skin ashen, her lips faintly trembling without sound. She was slight in build, no more than 28 or 30, athletic beneath the uniform, and even unconscious she carried the rigid posture of discipline drilled into bone. Elias hauled her free at last, collapsing backward into the snow with her body across his chest, Koda pressing close, breath fogging the storm as if trying to warm life back into her lungs. That was when Elias saw it clearly. The hand that had risen from the ice had not been reaching for rescue alone. It had been obeying instinct, the last reflex of a woman trained to survive. And in that frozen, silent instant, with the storm screaming and the river roaring beneath broken ice, Elias understood that the life he had buried on this ridge had just been unearthed by fate itself, and there would be no burying it again. The storm did not loosen its grip when Elias carried the unconscious woman back toward the cabin. If anything, it tightened, the wind cutting sideways like an unseen blade, the snow falling harder now, as if the mountain resented what had been taken from its frozen river. Koda ran ahead and behind in restless arcs, his breath pluming in heavy bursts, his body guarding the narrow path through the drifts as instinct drove him to shield both wounded and rescuer alike. The woman in Elias's arms was light despite her uniform, her body already losing its natural resistance to the cold. Limbs slack in the way only true hypothermia allowed, her soaked jacket stiffening as ice claimed it inch by inch. Elias felt the tremor in her core fade with every step, and the old medic inside him counted seconds even as panic tried to climb his spine. By the time the cabin came into view, the woman's skin had taken on the waxen pallor of deep cold, her lips faintly blue, breath shallow and irregular, the unmistakable signs of moderate to severe hypothermia, sliding quickly toward the edge of fatal. Inside the cabin, firelight fought bravely against the darkness as Elias lowered her to the floor near the hearth, sweeping aside blankets with hands that never truly remembered how to tremble when life hung in the balance. He locked the door against the storm with a single practiced motion, then knelt beside her, eyes sweeping over her face and uniform with ruthless efficiency. Up close, she looked younger than he had first thought, no more than 29, slim but strong in the shoulders and arms, with the kind of physique built by years of physical training rather than vanity. Her dark hair, once pulled tight beneath a cap, now lost to the river, clung wetly to her cheeks and throat, ice threading through it like crystal veins. A faint scar traced the curve of her jaw, old and pale, the only visible hint of past violence beneath the discipline of her bearing. Even unconscious, her body carried tension shaped by duty. Elias cut away the soaked jacket with his knife, then the shirt beneath, careful not to shock her system with sudden heat. Knowing too much warmth too fast could be as deadly as cold itself. Coda lay close, pressed against her side without touching, his warmth radiating like a living furnace as Elias worked. The dog's amber eyes never left the woman's face, tracking every twitch, every shallow rise of her chest. Elias stripped away the rest of her wet clothing down to thermal base layers, his movements precise, respectful, focused only on survival. He wrapped her in dry blankets but left her core exposed to the fire's distant heat, warming her gradually while his hands assessed pulse at neck and wrist, weak but present, irregular yet stubborn. He whispered under his breath, not prayers, not words, but the measured medical rhythm that had once guided him through blood and screaming sand, body temperature approximations, shock risks, oxygen demand, the fragile balance between rescue and catastrophe. The woman stirred faintly as sensation returned in erratic sparks, a soft sound escaping her lips that barely qualified as a breath. Elias leaned close, his voice steady and low. "You're safe now. Don't fight it. Stay still." For a moment, he thought she had not heard him. Then, with immense effort, her eyelids fluttered open, pupils unfocused, searching for shape and meaning through the fog of hypothermia. Her gaze fixed on his face, confusion and fear flickering together like weak flame. Her lips moved soundlessly once, twice. Elias leaned closer, straining to hear. A whisper crawled out of her throat at last, barely strong enough to survive the fire's crackle. "In my jacket, inside, there's something. They're using it to find me." The sentence shattered into silence as her eyes rolled back and her body slackened completely, consciousness slipping away as finally as the river had tried to claim her. Elias froze for one sharp second, the meaning of her words sinking into him with slow, dangerous clarity. Find me. They. Tracking. Coda growled low in his chest, not loud, not threatening, but edged with sharp awareness, as if the animal part of him had already reached the same conclusion. Elias moved fast now, retrieving the discarded jacket and feeling inside the soaked lining with careful fingers. He found it sewn into the seam near the collar, a small, rigid shape wrapped in waterproof polymer, a tracking device, military grade, active. His jaw tightened. Whoever had put this on her had not intended to lose her in the storm. Outside, wind battered the cabin walls as if emphasizing the truth he had just uncovered. This woman was not only a victim of the mountain, she was being hunted. Elias returned to her side, his hands returning to the work of survival with double urgency, carefully injecting a small measured dose of emergency adrenaline from the compact kit he kept hidden behind the hearthstones, the last remnants of a life he had sworn never to use again. Her body reacted faintly, pulse quickening slightly, breath deepening by a fraction as circulation fought back against the cold's grip. Coda shifted closer, placing his great head near her shoulder without touching. Warmth and presence offered as silent reinforcement. Elias studied her face as color slowly, almost reluctantly, began to creep back into her skin, though she remained unconscious, her body now caught in the long, slow climb out of death's shadow. Only then did Elias allow himself to study her more closely. This stranger fate had dragged into his isolation. Beneath the uniform and damage, there was an intensity to her features that spoke of conviction, not naivety. Her hands, though now trembling faintly from shock, bore the faint calluses of someone accustomed to weapons, to control, to struggle. She was not a lost hiker, not an accident of weather alone. She was an officer, a runner, and, now, a target. Elias sat back on his heels, exhaustion settling into his bones as the adrenaline receded, and for the first time in years, he felt the familiar weight of choice pressing down on his chest. He could stabilize her, wait for daylight, signal the town, and step back into the line of sight he had spent so long erasing. Or he could disappear again before the people she feared reached this ridge, leaving her to face that darkness alone. Coda lifted his head and met Elias's eyes with quiet insistence, not as a dog awaiting command, but as a survivor demanding honesty. Elias exhaled slowly, the sound catching in his throat as the memory of that Afghan storm rose unbidden. 2 wounded men, 1 choice, 1 life lost because of hesitation. Outside, the blizzard roared its relentless judgment. Inside, a woman fought for her next breath, and Elias understood with painful clarity that this time there would be no neutrality, no hiding within the storm's cover. By dawn, the world would change for all 3 of them, whether he willed it or not. Morning did not arrive at Frostfall Ridge with light so much as it arrived with a thinning of darkness, the storm finally loosening its grip into drifting sheets of snow that whispered rather than screamed, leaving the mountain wrapped in a gray stillness that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before judgment. Inside the cabin, fire had burned low through the night, and Elias had not slept. He sat on a rough wooden chair beside the hearth, elbows on his knees, watching the slow rise and fall of the woman's chest beneath layered blankets, as if the rhythm itself were the only thing holding the world together. Coda lay stretched along the floor between Elias and the door, head up, eyes open, a silent sentry whose muscles never fully released their tension. When the woman finally stirred again, it was not sudden, but gradual, like a soul testing the boundaries of return. Her fingers twitched first beneath the blankets, then her lips parted with a faint shudder of breath, and at last her eyelids lifted with visible effort, revealing dark eyes clouded by lingering shock and pain. She looked at the ceiling, at the beams, at the firelight flickering across unfamiliar walls, and confusion quickly sharpened into alarm as memory broke through the fog. Elias leaned forward slightly, careful not to crowd her. "You're safe for now," he said quietly, his voice steady but gentle, the tone he once used with wounded soldiers who no longer trusted the world to carry them. Her gaze snapped toward him, sharp despite the weakness in her body, assessing distance, threat, intent, the instinctive scan of someone trained to survive. She was pale, still shaking faintly from cold, her dark hair now loosely braided by Elias to keep it from freezing again, her face drawn tight with exhaustion and buried fear. "Where am I?" she whispered, the words cracked but steady enough to carry control beneath the damage. "A cabin on Frostfall Ridge," Elias replied. "You were trapped under the river ice." She swallowed slowly, a flicker of something dark and complicated crossing her eyes before she closed them again for a heartbeat, as if gathering strength. "Then they'll find me," she said. Elias did not answer at once. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and placed the small wrap device on the table beside her, where she could see it. "They already tried," he said. Her body went rigid beneath the blankets despite her weakness, eyes locking onto the object with quiet horror. "You found it," she breathed. "I didn't know it was there. They hit me from behind at the warehouse. I never felt it." Elias studied her face closely now, the way a medic once studied truth beneath blood and chaos. "Who put it on you?" he asked. A bitter smile touched her lips for an instant, sharp as broken glass. Someone who wore my badge, she answered. Silence stretched between them, thick with implications that needed no immediate names. After a moment, she turned her head slightly and met his eyes. My name is Hannah Pierce, she said, Internal Affairs Investigator, North Valley Precinct. The title landed in the quiet like a lit fuse. Elias absorbed it without visible reaction, but something tightened behind his eyes. You were running, he said. Hannah nodded faintly. From my own people, she replied. The words weighed more than any accusation spoken aloud. With careful effort, she shifted one arm free from the blankets and pointed weakly toward the soaked pack lying near the wall. There's a USB drive inside, encrypted, video files, body cam footage, financial transfers, warehouse security feeds. She drew a shallow breath. Proof. Elias stood slowly and retrieved the pack, unzipping it with deliberate calm. Inside, wrapped in plastic and sealed against moisture, was a slim black data drive no larger than his thumb. He turned it over once in his fingers, feeling the improbable weight of what it carried. Proof of what? He asked. Hannah's eyes closed briefly, and when she opened them again, there were tears there she did not allow to fall. Of a protection ring, she said. Drugs, stolen weapons, money laundering. Northvire Logistics is the front. The precinct is the shield. Her voice steadied as she spoke, anger overtaking fear in slow, controlled waves. I traced the payments. I saw the handoffs on the body cam. I matched the warehouse schedules to the dirty accounts. She exhaled sharply. And when I went to my captain, the man I trusted, he sold me instead. The words struck Elias like ice against bone, too familiar in their structure. Even if the setting differed, betrayal wore the same face in every uniform. He knocked me out, Hannah continued. Had the tracker sewn into my jacket while I was unconscious. I woke up in the storm, with men already hunting me through the pass. Her eyes flicked unconsciously toward the door, toward the mountain beyond. If you hadn't found me under the ice, I wouldn't be alive to say any of this. Code arose and padded quietly to Hannah's side, lowering his head near the edge of the blankets, his presence careful, warm, deliberate. Hannah's gaze shifted to him, surprise flickering across her face before softening into something like gratitude. He pulled you out, Elias said, just like he once pulled me back. Hannah studied the great dog with faint wonder. He's beautiful, she murmured. And he already knows what's coming, doesn't he? Coda's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, as if in answer. Elias moved back to his chair, the weight of the moment settling fully onto his shoulders now. If what you're saying is true, he said, the people after you won't stop because of a storm. Hannah's lips pressed together. They won't stop until they think I'm dead, she replied. And with that device active all night, they already know this cabin exists. The words tore straight through the fragile calm of the morning. Elias felt the old storm rising behind his ribs, the instinct to calculate escape routes, to weigh risks, to shrink from engagement as he had trained himself to do for years. He had built this life on the certainty that no one was coming for him anymore. Hannah had just proven that certainty false. He could leave. That part of his mind whispered it coldly and efficiently. He could cut the tracker battery, erase the signal trail, guide her partway down the ridge when she was strong enough, and vanish again before the hunters reached this height. The mountains still offered that mercy. But the other voice, the one he had tried to bury beneath snow and isolation, was already counting consequences through a medic's lens. Hannah was not stable enough to travel. The cold damage alone could kill her within hours if they moved her too fast. And even if they escaped the ridge, the corruption she carried inside that USB would not vanish with distance. If he walked away now, he would not merely be leaving a woman to die. He would be choosing silence again, over truth. Hannah watched him from beneath the blankets, seeing the war rage silently behind his eyes. You don't owe me anything, she said quietly. You already saved my life. Elias almost laughed, a dark, hollow sound that never quite escaped his throat. That's the problem, he replied softly. I once thought the same thing about someone else, and I was wrong. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere beyond the trees, a low mechanical hum threaded faintly through the thinning snow, so distant it was almost imagined. Coda stiffened immediately, rising to his feet with silent alarm, head turning toward the sound. Hannah's eyes widened despite her weakness. "That's a scanner," she whispered. Elias stood slowly, every muscle in his body tightening as the truth settled into place. The hunters were no longer only on the trail. They were near. The sound that threaded through the thinning snowfall was not loud enough to be called an engine, and not steady enough to be called wind. It was a living vibration that slid across distance with deliberate intent. And by the time Elias stepped to the window, the truth had already settled into his bones. Heat-sensing drones. Hannah's warning hung unfinished in the air, even as Coda bristled beside the door, muscles locking into a shape born of old battle memory. Outside, Frostfall Ridge lay trapped between gray sky and white earth, the storm reduced now to curtains of drifting snow that gave just enough visibility for death to choose its angles. They were not being rushed, they were being boxed in. Miles away, far below the ridge where town lights still flickered weakly beneath winter, Callahan stood on the edge of a cleared forest road and watched Frostfall Ridge through binoculars that cost more than a medic's yearly income. Deputy Chief Callahan was a tall, narrow man with a face carved thin by discipline and years of sanctioned violence, his gray hair cropped close to the skull, his eyes pale and patient as ice beneath shallow water. He wore his badge the way soldiers once wore their unit patches, not as decoration, but as shield and permission. Long before he had learned how to bend law, he had learned how to hunt. The army had taught him the mechanics. Corruption had taught him the art. "Don't advance," Callahan said calmly into his radio. "Circle and wait. Frostfall always forces its own mistakes." Around him, his men obeyed with disciplined efficiency. They did not surge forward, did not shout, did not announce their presence with bravado. Instead, they fanned out along the mountain's lower veins, closing roads with civilian patrol cars turned innocently sideways, sending young runners ahead into tree cover with thermal beacons, letting the drones above map out warm shapes against white death. No wolves howled. Real hunters never needed to. In the cabin, Elias moved with controlled speed, lowering the blinds, checking the emergency pack beneath the floorboards, counting weapons he had sworn never to count again. Hannah watched him from the cot, her face drained of color, not only from lingering hypothermia, but from the knowledge of who now hunted her. "He won't storm the cabin," she said quietly. "He never does. He waits until you move." Elias nodded. "That means we won't move," he replied. It was not bravado. It was calculation. Coda paced in short, silent arcs, nose lifting toward the faint electronic hum that drifted intermittently through the wind as drones shifted positions beyond the trees. The ridge, once Elias's refuge, had become a cage whose bars were made of heat and signal and patience. Hours passed without confrontation. The sky dimmed as clouds thickened again, the storm gathering fresh strength as if summoned by the tension below. Snow began to fall heavier once more, muting sound, blurring, distance, and for a fleeting moment, Elias allowed himself to believe that Frostfall might yet swallow their enemies as it had once swallowed him. It was during that fragile window of hope that he made his mistake. Hannah's breathing grew uneven as pain and cold flared together beneath her blankets, and Elias knelt beside her without thinking, his focus narrowing dangerously to the shallow rise of her chest, to the faint tremor in her fingers. "You're crashing," he murmured, reaching for medication. In that moment, his attention slipped fully inward, away from the ridge, away from the hunt. Coda's low growl came too late. The first shot shattered the left window in a burst of glass and sound. Splinters sprang across the cabin like frozen rain. Elias twisted instinctively, dragging Hannah's cot sideways as the second round punched through the wall where her chest had been moments before. The cabin erupted into chaos as bullets tore wood and air into fragments, each impact a thunderclap in the confined space. Elias threw himself over Hannah, shielding her with his body as memory roared back into his mind in blinding waves. Sandstorms and gunfire, men screaming his name, the weight of blood on his hands. Coda lunged not toward the door, but toward Elias, crashing into him with full force and driving both man and cot hard across the floor, just as a third round punched through the corner beam where Elias's head had been. The dog's shoulder clipped the edge of the table with a sickening thud, but he did not slow. Pain registered only as information to him now. Outside, the storm swallowed the muzzle flashes almost as soon as they bloomed, concealing shooters who never needed to reveal their exact positions. Callahan's voice traveled calmly through his headset as he observed from below. "Good," he said softly. "Pressure creates movement." Elias forced his lungs to pull air again, the metallic taste of panic thick in his mouth. His hands shook once, violently, before he crushed the tremor beneath raw will. "I froze," he whispered hoarsely, the admission torn straight from old scars. Coda's amber eyes met his for one charged instant, not with judgment, not with fear, but with command. "Move." Elias moved. He dragged the overturned table into position as a partial cover, sliding Hannah behind it while Coda took station at the narrow back corridor leading to the rear exit. Another shot tore through the front wall, burying itself in the hearthstones, where it erupted into sparks and dust. The hunters were tightening their ring, forcing reaction without full assault, probing for weakness. Elias checked the limited weapons he possessed, old defensive tools he had kept only because memory refused to let him feel safe without them. One rifle, 3 loaded magazines, a flare gun, not a soldier's arsenal, a survivor's. "They want me alive," Hannah said suddenly, her voice fragile but fierce. "He always does. Dead witnesses." "Don't suffer." Elias did not answer. The truth was he did not know whether that was still true. Callahan had already buried too many bodies beneath law to count. Outside, footsteps crunched closer now, spaced and steady, never rushed. A young voice drifted faintly through the storm, deliberately audible. "Miss Pierce!" it called, trembling just enough to sound unsure. "He says you don't have to die today." Hannah's hands curled into fists beneath the blankets. "He sent a kid," she whispered in bitter disbelief. Elias felt the trap even as the words landed. Young runners first, replacements second. Distance always preserved for the real hunters. Coda growled deep in his chest, the sound vibrating the floorboards like warning thunder. The young voice came again, closer now. "Just come out slow, he promised." Elias leaned close to Hannah. "He's bait," he said quietly, "and he will get killed if we move wrong." Another shot cracked past the doorway, close enough that splinters grazed Elias's cheek with razor heat. The wolves were no longer content with patience alone. The back corridor trembled under Coda's weight as the dog braced himself for impact that had not yet come. Then it happened. The door at the rear of the cabin burst inward in an explosion of wood as a body struck it at full run, thrown forward not by courage, but by terror. The young runner staggered through the doorway, eyes wide, barely older than 19, panic etched into every rigid line of him as he realized too late that he had been sacrificed to force the defenders into motion. Before Elias could even rise, a second figure lunged behind him from the storm, weapon raised. Coda launched with devastating force. The impact drove both of them across the threshold and into the snow outside, the dog's full weight slamming the shooter flat before the trigger could finish its pull. The crack of the rifle went wild into the sky as Coda's jaws clamped down on the attacker's forearm, wrenching the weapon free in one violent, practiced motion. The young runner screamed and fled blindly into the storm, leaving blood and fear behind him. Elias surged to the doorway, rifle raised, heart hammering like it had not in years, just in time to see figures melt back into treeline as Callahan ordered withdrawal from this angle. They had tested the cabin's teeth and found them alive. The storm swallowed sound again, leaving only the ragged echo of breath and the drip of melting snow off the threshold. Coda limped back inside moments later, blood staining his shoulder where a blade had caught him in the struggle, eyes still burning with readiness, as if daring the mountain to send the wolves again. Elias sank to his knees beside him, hands hovering, torn between relief and terror. "You saved me," he whispered. The truth struck him harder than the bullets had missed. This time, it had been Coda who moved when Elias almost did not. Outside, Callahan lowered his binoculars with mild interest. The game had shifted. The prey was not breaking yet. "Good," he murmured to the wind. "Now we make it bleed." Night returned to Frostfall Ridge with merciless speed. dragging fresh snowfall behind it like a curtain closing on a final act that none of them had chosen yet could no longer escape. The storm had grown violent again after dusk, wind tearing across the treetops with animal fury, snow spiraling so thick that even the nearest pines blurred into pale ghosts. Inside the cabin, silence had sharpened into something brittle after the earlier assault, every creak of the wood sounding like a warning whispered too late. Elias moved with restrained urgency, reinforcing what little could be reinforced, wrapping Hannah in additional thermal layers and bandaging Coda's wounded shoulder as best he could, with trembling hands that refused to fully steady. The dog did not whine, did not pull away, only watched Elias with quiet endurance as blood slowly darkened the cloth at his side. Pain was now simply another piece of weather they endured together. Hannah lay propped against the wall near the hearth, her face still pale but eyes fiercely awake despite the weakness in her body, watching both men with a mixture of guilt and resolve that made Elias uneasy in a way that no rifle ever could. "He won't wait much longer," she said softly. "Callahan never lets a night like this pass without taking something." Elias knew she was right. Wolves did not circle endlessly. They closed. Outside, faint movement traced the tree line at irregular intervals, shadows flickering between drifts, silent figures advancing and pulling back with the patience of men who were not afraid of time. Coda's ears twitched at each distant shift, his body angling subtly toward unseen threats. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle he had sworn never to hold again, feeling the old rhythm pulse faintly in his blood as memory and instinct collided within him. Fear was there, yes, but beneath it ran something colder and steadier now, a clarity born not of duty, but of choice. This time, he would not hesitate. The first gunshot came without warning, not at the cabin, but far to the east, a deliberate signal cutting through the storm like a bell. A second followed, closer now. Callahan was releasing his wolves. The windows trembled as bullets struck the outer walls again, testing angles, flushing movement, driving response. Elias shifted position instinctively, firing once into shadow, not to hit, but to announce that the cabin still possessed teeth. Return fire came swift and sharp. Wood splintered, the air filled with the sting of close passage. In the chaos, a blast caught Elias as he leaned to reposition, not in the chest, but through the left shoulder, the impact spinning him hard against the wall as pain erupted in blinding heat. The world narrowed instantly to sound and white shock. The rifle dropped from his hand. Blood spread rapidly beneath his coat, warmth draining fast into the freezing air. He barely registered Coda's roar as the dog lunged at the advancing silhouette that had exploited the opening, slamming into the attacker with ferocious momentum and driving him back into the snow. The two vanished in a violent tumble beyond the doorway, Coda's body a dark blur against white storm as he fought to keep Elias from being finished where he fell. Hannah screamed Elias's name, the sound ripping free of her lungs before she could stop it, and in that instant she made her choice. Weak as she was, she tore herself free of the blankets, staggering toward the door, each step an act of rebellion against the limits of her own body. The storm seized her immediately, cold crashing against her exposed skin with brutal force, but she did not stop. She fired the flare gun Elias had left near the hearth straight into the sky, a streak of searing red tearing upward through swirling snow like a wound in the darkness. Callahan's men cursed as the night betrayed their concealment for one raw instant, silhouettes sharp against the blaze of artificial dawn. The flare did not aim to strike them. It aimed to be seen. Far below the ridge, beyond the storm-wrapped forest roads, that single reckless spark was enough. 2 weeks earlier, long before Hannah had fled the warehouse and before Callahan had sealed his betrayal, she had sent encrypted copies of every file she possessed to an old academy friend now embedded with federal investigators in Seattle, a final contingency she had prayed she would never need. When her signal vanished, when the tracker showed sudden violent movement through prohibited terrain, that friend had acted. Federal warrants had been authorized within hours. Tactical teams had been mobilized before the mountain had a chance to swallow the truth again. Now, through the storm and darkness, the sound of approaching engines threaded faintly through wind and gunfire alike, Not the isolated hum of drones, but the heavy coordinated growl of a larger force cutting up the valley. Callahan heard it at the same moment his men did. For the first time that night, patience cracked. "Advance!" he snapped into his radio. "Finish this now!" His remaining shooters surged forward through snow and shadow, abandoning stealth for speed as the trap collapsed inward. Gunfire erupted from all sides in sudden violent chorus. One of his men fell near the tree line, struck by return fire from unseen figures now racing the storm from below. Another slipped on ice and did not rise again. The mountain had taken its toll. Coda reappeared at the doorway, blood matting his fur, limping but unbroken, dragging a wounded attacker who went still at the threshold, breath extinguished more by cold than by impact. It was the only death that night not engineered by calculation. Inside the cabin, Elias fought to remain conscious as Hannah crawled back to him through drifting ash and snow, pressing her hands hard against his wound to slow the blood despite the tremor racking her arms. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely. "You don't get to disappear again. Not now." Elias tried to answer her, tried to smile at the stubborn fire in her eyes, but the edges of his vision were already darkening, the storm inside his body drowning out the one beyond the walls. The door burst inward again, not with the reckless violence of before, but with controlled force as armed figures swept inside in disciplined formation, calling out identification codes that split through the chaos with authority no corruption could mimic. FBI tactical units flooded the cabin in moments, weapons trained outward as medics pushed past them toward Elias and Coda without hesitation. Callahan was dragged from the tree line shortly after, pinned face down into the snow with his arms wrenched behind his back, fury and disbelief bleeding through the mask of authority he had worn for too many years. He did not look at Hannah as they passed her by, only stared at the storm with hollow eyes as the wolves he had loosed were finally leashed. The mountain fell quiet again in the aftermath, wind settling into weary sighs across broken snow. Elias felt hands at his shoulder, pressure, voices calling him back through the fog, but the night was already pulling him under with cold and blood and exhaustion. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Coda's great head resting against the stretcher beside him, amber eyes still burning with fierce watchfulness, refusing to leave even as the world shifted beneath their feet. Spring did not arrive at Frostfall Ridge with celebration. It came quietly, almost apologetically, as if the mountain itself were unsure whether it had the right to soften after everything it had taken. The snow withdrew inch by inch from the lower slopes, revealing dark earth scarred by winter's violence, and thin veins of meltwater traced trembling paths through the ice as the river beneath learned how to breathe again. For months, Elias Ward had watched those changes from a hospital window far below the ridge, his body bound in steel and gauze, his shoulder rebuilt, piece by piece, beneath the careful hands of surgeons who spoke of recovery in numbers and limitations rather than hope. 6 months of physical therapy followed the night the snow took a life and spared another. 6 months of relearning balance, of accepting that strength could be something different than what it used to mean. The bullet had missed the bone by a fraction that no skill could claim credit for, but nerves had not been so fortunate, leaving his left arm weaker than the right, and heavy loads forever forbidden. When Elias finally returned to Frostfall Ridge, he did so with scars both visible and hidden, and with the quiet knowledge that some doors, once passed through, never opened the same way again. The cabin stood exactly where it always had, still half sunk into the slope, still bearing the faint scars of gunfire along its walls like pale memories etched into wood. But the air around it felt different now. The isolation that had once wrapped the ridge like armor had loosened, threads of connection trailing back up the mountain in the form of radio lines, supply paths, and the faint but steady flow of hikers who came seeking what winter had tried to erase. Coda returned with him, older by the calendar now, but older still by the weight of wounds earned in loyalty. The injury to his shoulder had ended his days of charging headlong into danger. The joint would never hold like it once had, and the veterinarians had spoken gently but firmly of retirement as if it were both blessing and sentence. Coda did not understand the words, only the change in how his body answered commands, how the pain returned if he pushed too hard, how the fierce fire that had once driven his leaps now tempered itself into watchful warmth. Yet, When he crossed the threshold of the cabin again, his tail swept wide across the floor in a slow, satisfied arc, and he lowered his great body near the hearth, not as a soldier waiting for orders, but as a guardian who had chosen peace. Hannah Pierce came back to the ridge months later, not in uniform, but in a dark coat that caught the spring light along its edges as she climbed the trail with careful steps. The promotion that had followed the collapse of North Valley's corruption had been swift and brutal in equal measure. She now served as an internal inspector at a federal level, a title that carried authority but also isolation, the kind that turned colleagues into obstacles and conversations into minefields. The media had not released her name easily after the arrests, and when they had, the flood that followed had been merciless. For every voice that called her brave, another whispered traitor. Pressure had become her constant shadow, tighter than any tracker ever sewn into fabric. Yet she climbed the ridge anyway, carrying not evidence now, but a quiet need that paperwork could not answer. Elias saw her before she reached the door, standing on the narrow porch with sunlight in her hair and fatigue in her posture, her face still marked by faint scars of cold and stress, but steadied by something that had grown stronger beneath them. He opened the door without speaking. Neither of them reached for words right away. They had said everything that mattered already in blood and snow. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than memory, not only from the fire, but from the life that had returned to it. Medical supplies lined one wall now in neat rows, clean bandages, oxygen tanks, portable heaters, a defibrillator secured with straps that gleamed faintly in the light. Elias no longer called it a home alone, it was a station, a place where storms no longer ended in solitude. "You really did it," Hannah said softly as she took in the room. "You built the first aid post." Elias nodded. "Free for climbers, hikers, anyone who makes the mistake of trusting these mountains too much." A faint smile touched her lips. "That sounds familiar." Outside, Coda lay stretched in a patch of sunlight that spilled across the porch boards, his injured shoulder angled carefully against the warmth, his eyes half closed, chest rising and falling in slow contentment. Once, every sound had meant danger. Now, the only thing that stirred him was the soft whistle of wind through bare branches and the distant call of water breaking free beneath thawed ice. He no longer sprang to his feet at every echo. His vigilance had transformed into something gentler, and in that gentleness there was a peace none of them had known before. Hannah joined Elias on the porch steps, lowering herself carefully beside him. The river below sang louder now, no longer trapped beneath a coffin of ice, but racing joyfully through channels remade by melt and time. "They tried to bury it," she said after a moment. "The trial, the deeper links, they always do." Elias did not look at her as he answered. "Did they succeed?" Hannah shook her head slowly. "Not this time. Too many files moved too far. Too many eyes learned where to look." She exhaled, the sound heavy with exhaustion. "But they made sure I paid for it in quieter ways." Elias turned to her then. "And was it worth it?" Hannah met his gaze without hesitation. "I almost died under that ice," she said. "If the truth had stayed buried with me, that would have been the only ending that meant nothing." Elias absorbed her words in silence, the mountain air carrying them away like a final judgment rendered without ceremony. He thought of all the lives that had passed through his hands in the years before he vanished, all the ones he had saved and the one he had not, and he realized with sudden clarity that redemption had never been about erasing loss. It had been about refusing to let loss be the only voice left behind. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Elias treated minor injuries and altitude sickness with the quiet confidence that had once defined him on battlefields far from this thawing ridge. Children came with scraped knees and left with wrapped elbows and wide eyes. Climbers arrived shaking from storms and left warmed and steadied. Word spread downward into the valley that the ghost medic had become something else entirely, not a rumor, but a constant. Hannah remained only a few days before duty called her back into corridors of gray walls and careful words. But when she left, she did so without the hollow urgency that had once driven her flight. As she walked down the trail, she turned once to look back at the cabin and at the man standing beside it, and she lifted her hand in silent acknowledgement of a chapter closed without needing to be forgotten. Weeks later, on a morning washed clean by early sunlight, Elias sat on the porch beside Coda and watched the mountain breathe without snow for the first time in years. The scars in the earth were still there, dark reminders of what winter had demanded, but they no longer felt like graves. Coda shifted slightly, settling deeper into warmth, one paw resting against Elias's boot in simple contact that asked for nothing more than presence. Elias let his weaker arm rest across his knee without shame now, the old ache a companion rather than an enemy. And for the first time since the storm that had ended everything and begun something new, he allowed himself to believe that survival did not always require running. The mountain did not ask him to disappear anymore. It asked him to remain. And so he did. There are storms that come not to kill us, but to force us to remember that we are still alive. Sometimes the miracles of God do not arrive with thunder or bright signs from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly through a wounded man who chooses to stand again, through a loyal dog who refuses to leave his side, and through a broken soul who dares to tell the truth, even when it costs everything. In our daily lives, we all face storms that try to freeze our faith, bury our hope, and convince us to give up. But God never leaves us in the snow alone. He sends help in ways we do not expect, and often through people and moments we never saw coming. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need strength today. Leave your thoughts in the comments and tell us what this story made you feel. And if you believe in the quiet miracles God sends every day, please type Amen in the comments as a sign of your faith. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and healing in every season of life. And please remember to press subscribe to support this YouTube channel so we can continue bringing you stories of hope, courage, and redemption.